I talk to people every day that they're like, yeah, we got this. I can see it. I mean, it's really just, I think, people being a little overly confident that they can see something that's like actually molecular. It's just education that's going into that. Either that or the most convincing way to sell people on pathogen testing is that they have lost rooms or facilities and had to start over again and lost hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. And then they're like, oh, yeah, I'm going to do this forever. And we're trying to help people not have to go through that to say, okay, we can spend a few $1,000s a month on this to have confidence that we can catch things early.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 138 of High Spirits, the show where cannabis industry insiders pull back the curtain on what's actually happening in the market. I'm Ben Larson.
And I'm Anna Ray Grabstein. And every Tuesday, we're trying to have conversations that engage your curiosity and get you thinking more deeply about what really matters in our industry.
It is May 19th, 2026, and today's guest is Melanie Nash, CEO of Toomey Genomics. We're going to be diving into all things genetics, the plant, and everything we should all be thinking about. I'm excited to get back into the plant. I know Anna Ray loves plants. Are you growing a plant currently, Anna Ray?
I plan to grow 2 cannabis plants in my backyard, which is our usual, but I don't have them yet. We've got this problem, which is sort of hilarious, which is that if I plant them too early, they get too big and I end up with too much weed. And
Shame.
and, I don't. It's like too much. What am I going to do with that? So we
Instead of
generally
making jams, you're making mason jars full of weed and just passing them out around the neighborhood.
Totally. But the planting that I'm doing now is I have planted my summer garden of tomatoes and herbs and some squash and replanted some of my beautiful San Pedro cactuses from pots into the ground. So it's definitely kind of a garden vibe in May here in Sonoma County.
Oh, I have
You,
some
you
San
planting
Pedros from a
anything?
certain someone. I need to get them out of their pots. They've been in them for a year. Um,
What's going on in your world?
oh, less gardening, but I'm excited to know that I'm not behind schedule when it comes to spring planting. We do tend to plant a little something here and there. I'm not as much of a green thumb as you, but I did spend some time out on the greens yesterday, playing some golf. Took a little bit of break from my normal schedule, but it's funny when I'm golfing, I constantly think about what a good mental exercise it is as it relates to running a business. Just
Hmm.
that the constantly being faced with, whether it's unexpected terrain or conditions. Yesterday was very windy, which I don't know. Wind for me is just really interesting. It like psychologically messes with me, not just the ball. Um, but inevitably in golf, no matter how good you are, you have bad hits and you have to mentally recalibrate and just it can last. Sometimes you get in this funk and it's hard and like you have to break free. Inevitably you do. And I don't know, it's just something about it that makes it seem like really good brain training for running a business.
Yeah, sounds like a metaphor for what we're dealing with in cannabis
Yeah.
regularly and certainly right now.
Right now. Lots of crosswinds, lots of trying to understand what's around the corner. I'm excited about today in particular, just because like getting back into the roots of the industry and focusing on the plant instead of everything that's going on around us. But
I know. Well, we do have some news queued up to highlight first. So maybe we jump
yeah,
in, we get the news out of the way, and then we'll start talking about the plant. Sound
yeah,
good?
I love it. I
Awesome.
love it.
So, story number one is that Georgia has overhauled its medical cannabis program. Governor Brian Kemp signed Senate Bill 220, putting Georgia's Patients First Act into law last week, which expands the state's tightly controlled medical cannabis program in a few significant ways. The bill replaces Georgia's old 5% potency cap with a 12,000 milligram THC limit, adding new qualifying conditions and notably allowing vapes as a delivery method for patients 21 and older, which is a first. Previously, there were no inhalable form factors allowed. So, The commission has until January to finalize testing and packaging rules, but these new products are expected to hit shelves this summer. And it's one to watch because Georgia has long been one of the most restricted medical cannabis markets in the country. And this signals meaningful patient expansion and access in a state that's been slow to move. So we are excited for Georgia and excited for the patients there.
Yeah, Georgia's a really interesting market and happening just at the right time, as we talk about rescheduling and the importance of medical cannabis, opening it up. Historically the physicians, there's just a lot of friction because what was required, and we discussed this on This Week in Cannabis last week, with Judson, from Fine Fettle, is that you had to be like at your wits end, have exercise like every other means available to you before getting to cannabis, and that just created a lot of uncertainty and friction with the doctors. And so I think there was something like 5,000 patients or something very small,
Yeah,
13,000.
not a lot, not enough
Yeah.
patients for sure.
But now that's gone away, and basically physicians are free to recommend it. So it's just going to explode. And also happening in Georgia is that you have this low dose hemp consumables in the mainstream retail market. So you have beverages, gummies, that kind of thing. So it's this kind of bifurcated market, and you can also get those products in dispensaries. And so you're seeing this interesting these two layers that are kind of bridging the lack of an adult use program. And with all this movement at the federal level, you start to think it's like, oh, is Georgia creating a model about what the future could look like for cannabinoids?
Yeah, when we spoke to Judson on Friday, I was surprised to realize that hemp products could be sold in the medical dispensaries, and I think you're right. It is a potential future path in a medical only market that could bifurcate like high potency products in certain areas, but still creating access in dispensaries to products that maybe can go over state lines theoretically if we're also lucky. Um,
We'll see.
while we are on the thread of medical, the House voted to let VA doctors recommend medical marijuana to veterans. So, important to note, this hasn't yet passed through the Senate, but the House of Representatives did vote to let military veterans receive recommendations for medical marijuana through their doctors at the VA. And it was a bipartisan amendment from Representatives Brian Mast, Dave Joyce, and Dina Titus. And if it passes through the Senate, it would prevent the VA from enforcing a long-standing directive that has blocked providers from helping veterans register for state medical cannabis programs. So this feels really notable, along with all of the other kind of wind behind the back of medical right now that started
Mhm.
with Donald Trump and the executive order and is continuing on with Schedule 3 and kind of the whole industry grappling with how to both comply and create opportunities within a Schedule 3 landscape. Medical is it's on our lips a lot more than it has been for a long time.
Yeah, yeah, this is huge, and the veterans getting the medicine that they need. We know very personally through a lot of people in the cannabis network that this has just been a massive void. We know cannabis has very relevant medical applications, and finally there's some wind in the sails here. The other interesting aspect here is there's just a lot of change afoot, right? I was on a prep call for the upcoming Canra stakeholder event, and the biggest question that regulators have is, what does the future look like? What should they be prepared for? And I think it's so interesting to start to understand. It's like regulators alongside us as operators are all just trying to figure out what's going on. And I think no one knows, but it's a lot of movement, it's a lot of progress, and this one aspect is like, it's one of those things where it's like all the complexity around it doesn't matter as much as how important it is that the veterans are finally getting access to cannabis.
Heck yeah. Heck yeah. Cool. Well, on to story number 3, our last and final story, global report on pricing compression and what it means for operators. A new report came out from the Global Cannabis Network Collective and Whitney Economics, introducing price compression as one of the clearest indicators of market maturity. And the report draws on data from mature US markets, Canada, and Germany, while also analyzing emerging trends across Europe and Latin America. The core finding is that while new cannabis markets often launch with elevated pricing and strong growth expectations, most eventually face sustained downward pricing pressure as supply expands. Regulations evolve and markets mature. The takeaway for operators seems simple, is that if you're planning international expansion or entering a new state, the pricing trajectory is predictable. And the question is whether you're building a business that can survive it. We've been talking about this the whole time we've been recording this podcast. We see pricing constantly, and prices are high when a market launches and they go down. But now we have an actual report out to prove it.
Yeah, the nice thing about being where we are today, it's almost like we know what the horizon looks like. And so instead of this being pricing compression, it's just driving towards the normal pricing, right? And what it actually is just a removal of the premiums we're paying for inefficiency. And so it's like that cycle is happening faster. People are getting smarter with their businesses. The systems are becoming more sophisticated. And instead of repeating the same problems over the course of years, it's figuring itself out faster and faster. And a big part of that, and what I'm excited to talk about today is what Toomey Genomics focuses on, and fixing that at the root level with genetics, and making sure that the cultivators are able to grow efficiently and not have a ton of loss, right? And so it's like these elements work themselves into every step of the supply chain, and eventually it all gets figured out. And that's why these big sophisticated operators are winning in these various markets.
Yeah, I mean, for years we used to talk about that there was no case study to cannabis, and the endless people that I heard say, like, we're building the plane as we're flying it. And yes, and I think at this point there are no case studies that we get to look at, and we understand what creates like a pattern of a market maturing, and certainly efficient production is at the core of it. So let's queue up and bring on Melanie. Today's guest is Melanie Nash. She spent over a decade building operational infrastructure in cannabis, moving from retail to deep genetics work in Oakland as COO at Dark Heart Nursery, where her team first identified hop latent viroid in cannabis, and then later serving as COO at Purple City Genetics. And now she's the CEO of Toomey Genomics, where she's building scalable testing and intervention infrastructure to help operators manage plant pathogens as a business system, not a crisis response. She brings a rare combination of operations experience, deep scientific credibility, and an operator's instinct. And Melanie's also a good friend. So Melanie, welcome to the show. Happy to have you.
Thanks so much. I'm so glad to be here.
Amazing.
And I just want to say how excited I am about the what you just mentioned about veterans access. My husband's an Iraq war vet, so dear to my heart. And I know that a lot of his friends won't use it because of the stigma. And I think that this can also just like help it be more approachable, as well as legal.
Yeah, I was talking to Amber Center here in the Bay Area, and she was explaining that she was being forced to make a decision, like to continue using cannabis, which she uses for lupus every day, or quit that and be eligible for a trial surgery, which
through the VA.
Which being forced to make that decision, it's like, oh, do you want to maintain your quality of life, or do you want to take a chance and go through this surgery? But you can't have both.
Yeah, it's a big step. It's great.
Good. Well, okay, let's dive in. Genetics. It's where every cannabis product begins, before the lights go on, before the nutrient program. And I think that it's a misunderstood part of the cannabis supply chain and of the early phases of cultivation. Melanie, you have spent more time than most people I know working in genetics. I would love it if you could give us a little background about your career path in genetics, but also about how the genetics kind of space operates right now in cannabis.
Sure. So, yeah, I started in cannabis as a dispensary manager for a year and a half, and then came out to California in 2017 as a sales operations manager at Dark Heart, like not knowing anything about genetics or plants or anything. He was really brought in as operations and sales, and leading the team as it was growing. So, I mean, I learned a lot, over those first couple of years of just like how does a nursery work. It's really like the only part of the supply chain that's like truly perishable. Anything that you make is going to die within 10 to 14 days. So kind of forecasting is super important. And, as trends change so quickly, you need to ramp up the mother stock, and then suddenly that strain isn't popular anymore. So it's a really challenging part of the space. So yeah, Dark Heart was really one of the largest nurseries at the time, and we sold clones all over the state, and from small growers up in Humboldt to the really large companies that were coming online, and really trying to push to be the core supplier, like having Dark Heart be that we're going to supply you all of your clones that you need. You don't need to worry about your own mother stock. Use that space for flower. When you do the ROI calculation, that makes sense, but it is really difficult to like line up exactly with people's production plans. And so it makes sense that a lot of growers in California still have their own nurseries and their own mother stock, and then also source clones from the nurseries. And Purple City Genetics, I mean, they're at heart a breeder, and are really kind of pushing the cutting edge of bringing high quality genetics to growers. And I think the difference is kind of paying attention to the consumer trends, and also thinking about the agronomic traits that are going to make something productive. I say hourly employee proof. What are the things that are going to bring the yield, the THC, be easy to grow, that I think a lot of other breeders don't necessarily focus on. It's just on the hype and making it purple enough and making it 45% and everything that people are looking for. But that's not always what's going to make a cultivator successful. There's a lot of other traits there. At Purple City, we did, since we sold seeds, we also got into working with other markets and international, really with the 2018 Farm Bill. And so that was really interesting, because in most other markets outside of California, there's not the nursery infrastructure. That was like kind of unique to California. In the early 2000s, there was kind of the specialty like cookies strains, and they kind of identified a niche that people are going to want to source genetics from a quality operator, whereas in the newer markets, it's really either like basically ignored, and they say, oh, it's immaculate conception, figure it out, or you're required to start from seed and you have to pheno hunt, and just not really, the regulations aren't setting up something that's like should be a very important part of an agricultural supply chain, and is in every other agricultural supply chain, that there's universities or nurseries that are like holding genetics and making sure that they're clean, and there's chain of custody and everything, and that just has been ignored in cannabis. So that was something that we worked on, is like helping growers source good genetics and stay ahead. I mean, obviously it's a big part of differentiating for companies, and having something that's new and special or works within their environment. And so I got a lot of exposure in those other markets where there's not the nursery infrastructure that there is in California.
Before we dive into the nuts and bolts around everything, one of the narratives I've been hearing about all this change we've been seeing at the federal level is a potential, secondary implication of this new hemp language, and how like it might complicate the transfer of seeds and genetics from across state lines. Is this something that you're tracking, or has this been debunked? Because I haven't heard it very loudly, but there have been a few people where it's just like the problematic federal language that is being written in these voids might have like downstream effects that are very much challenge the movement of genetics across state lines.
Mm-hmm. I'm not following it as closely as I used to because now we're focused on pathogens, but I have seen a lot of concerns, particularly from the seed companies. I mean, a lot of them have just e-commerce sites set up, and it's a big part of their business that could be totally shut down. But and then at the same time, I think it will also continue to operate the way it always has. I mean, it's like a pretty easy thing to move around.
Yeah, this immaculate conception
Yeah.
it comes back.
I mean, the genetics still need to come from somewhere, so they're
Right.
going to move around.
Well, so genetics coming from somewhere, it also brings up the trust problem that people have with genetics in terms of strains being renamed and not knowing the lineage of where things are, and even the debates around indica sativa hybrid and what really matters. How much do you think that stuff really matters? How much is it important to you in the way that you are approaching, the way you perceive genetics?
Yeah, I think that, well, I mean, number one, everything's a hybrid. So let's just call them what they are. No one's growing a real sativa that is 14 weeks, and so everything's a hybrid. And well, I do think that there's a big miss and loss right now in terms of the work that the breeders are doing. I get it that it's like really tough to be a cultivator and you need to sell what you grow, and so if it helps to rename, that's what they do. But it's really underserving the work that the breeders are doing, and I think that that's a disservice to the industry as a whole, because if the breeders can't be recognized and we can't compensate them properly, we're going to lose them. And then what will that leave us with? Just Philip Morris doing breeding for us in the future when everything's legal. Like I think we want to as an industry work to preserve the work that they're doing, because it is an art and a science, and they're the ones that have like the deep libraries and things that we can still hunt through to look for minor cannabinoids, look for other characteristics. And right now they're just it's all kind of underground, and sometimes you're doing deals with a breeder, or sometimes they're doing licensing deals with nurseries, but there's just really not a lot that you can go on to verify. So I think working directly with the breeders that you like and verifying with your nursery, are you do you have a royalty deal, or did you just buy this at a show and propagated it and you're not actually compensating the breeder? I think those are important questions that are kind of like fundamental to preserving the what's important about this industry.
Focusing a lot on genetics and like you bring up minor cannabinoids, and for a long time, those of us in the industry that appreciate the dynamic of the plant and the different genetics and what they lead to, like, what do you envision the future to be like working away from this really high THC percentage? Like, how do we bring back that focus and respect for these complex strains?
Well, I think there just has to be a lot more research to demonstrate what things are going to do for people and what products are going to work. I mean, it's still so trial and error, and as things become more open and legal, more universities can look at it. There's just going to be more people that can check it out and see how it will help. And I think that, there's always going to be the high THC driving it, but I think the more normalized it gets, the more consumers there are, they're going to demand different things. I mean, I'm a low dose person. I don't have drinks more than 2 milligrams. I have like 2 puffs, and I get like excited if I have something that's 10% and maybe has some other minor cannabinoids that I can actually like smoke a whole joint and not be like going to sleep immediately. So there's definitely people out there, and I think that it's just a matter of it opening up and doing the research.
Yeah, kind of reminds me of the low alcohol movement right now, and
Totally.
beers being released purposefully with less alcohol versus being restricted to it.
Mhm.
Yeah, maybe as humans we just like what we can't have. So
Well, so we kind of set the stage, talked about genetics, and in the beginning we were talking about price compression across markets, and one of the things that happens as markets mature in cannabis is that every single part of the supply chain, which really starts with genetics and cultivation, needs to focus on efficiency. And now you've moved from genetics to leading a science and pathogen company, TUMI, and you guys are focused specifically on cultivation and what's happening there in terms of these pathogens that are showing up in the plants that are hurting the output, hurting the yields. Um, and I'm not sure that people really understand how widespread pathogens are in the cannabis supply chain. And so I think that that's where we should start, is if you could help us to understand kind of what are the major pathogens in the plant and how widespread are they?
Sure. So the main pathogen that I think gets the most attention is hop latent viroid, and that has been around probably 15 or 20 years. You kind of started on the West Coast and was identified in 2019 as HLBD as the causative agent, and it's pretty devastating to cannabis plants. It can kind of live, latently, as it's in the name, and then pop up and cause massive losses of yield and potency. And it is just like a naked RNA. There's no like protein code around it, so that means that like a lot of sterilizers don't work, like quats or alcohol. Like bleach is the only thing that you can use to sterilize, and it's super important that a lot of people don't know. And it's spread pretty easily, like through tools, water, seeds, hands, clothing. So, really strict sanitation protocols are really important for hop latent viroid. Fusarium, maybe even worse than hop latent viroid. I mean, this is a true fungus. It's literally everywhere: air, soil, media, shoes, and it's there's like over 400 strains, but there are actually 21 that have been identified in cannabis and only 9 that are cause symptoms in cannabis. And it's just a super stable organ. The spores can live in 10 years, and you could be as sterile as you want, but as soon as something sporulates, it'll come out. And what's interesting about Fusarium is that it just doesn't show symptoms in veg, so nurseries don't really notice it, and it really kind of pops up when you flip to flower, when the plant's kind of stressed out at that point. And so it's super important to make sure that the plants that you're sourcing don't have Fusarium. It's really hard to get rid of once you have it in a facility. Pythium is the third one that is a problem. It's not quite as devastating as the other two, but it's not actually a fungus. It's closer to an algae, and water is the main vector for it. And so it's important to test the water regularly. And I mean, these pathogens are ubiquitous. I mean, we've tested over 2,000 facilities in the last 4 years, and over 82% have tested positive for hop latent viroid. It's regular, each year, Fusarium and Pythium are around 35 to 40% of facilities that we test. And so it's a huge problem, and when we'll talk more about what to do about it, what it's costing you.
Yeah, it's hard to kind of wrap your head. Like, those are very large numbers. I think you said like 82% or something like that.
Mhm.
So what does that actually mean? What's the downstream effects of that? If you're finding it in a facility, is it getting onto the plants and then rendering the plants unusable? Or, like, as a non-grower here, I need
Mhm.
it broken down just a little bit more. Like, what are the downstream impacts of these pathogens being existing in a facility?
Definitely. So for hop latent viroid, the downstream impacts is that it's going to be yield loss and potency reduction. And the straight averages are that of the 82% that have tested positive, 22% of the plants are positive. And and that causes a 40% yield loss. So the basics of that is that it's basically like 1 in 10 pounds that you're producing is just out the door. If you don't know that you have it, and it can be kind of subtle. A lot of growers kind of think that they can see the symptoms and they call it out themselves, but what we've seen is that it's really only the cultivators that test on a regular basis that see meaningful reductions in that, versus the ones that just kind of come in sporadically. They stay around that 20 to 25% infection rate. So hop lane viroid, if you're not paying attention to it, you're probably just throwing out 1 of every 10 pounds that you're producing. For Fusarium, that is really more devastating. That like if there's an infection and it starts to sporulate, it can knock out whole rooms and whole greenhouses, and then you're having to kill everything, sanitize. You're probably going to lose a couple of runs, and this can come in. We've seen it pretty commonly coming in from media. And so, testing, your inputs, your water, your media, on a regular basis is really important to make sure that it's not just the plants that you're bringing in. That's what a lot of people, blame, the clones, but there's all the other things that you're bringing in that, there's claims, but you still need to verify who your vendors are that you're working with.
So you just dropped some pretty big numbers, and I want to contextualize them a little bit in that, like, we often talk about earnings reports and MSOs who often will have wholesale businesses that are larger than $100 million of just wholesale flower sales from a particular business. And if you're saying that they could be losing 10%, on a $100 million wholesale business, that could mean that you're losing $10 million a year because you have hop in your grow rooms.
Yep.
Not to mention if you have Fusarium or these other types of pathogens. And yet we also know that cultivation is the most expensive part of the supply chain to build out. And as all these different states have come online, companies are building these enormously expensive cultivation assets. And so I figure that people must be doing like pretty intense intervention to try to stop this stuff. But from getting to know you, I've been surprised to learn how many groups have yet to kind of take that step to start doing preventative work and testing. I mean, from your perspective, like how much of the industry is doing what it should be doing to get in front of these devastating effects of what could be happening in their cultivation operations?
Definitely not enough. I mean, I actually, say to the team, like, sure, there's competitors, but our biggest competitor is just not testing. And it's really about educating people about how important this is. And we've seen, I mean, number one, it is kind of surprising, right? Like in every other agricultural product, this is treated as a line item in your P&L. There are, certain regulations for it from the USDA. And so a lot of times we see that people that come from, other ag, understand this pretty well and are, fine spending a little money on preventative testing. But there's just something about, the legacy cannabis operators that a lot of times they're like, yeah, I can see it, or, I got this, or they're like digging into some nutrient issue or some other thing without ruling this out. And a lot of times this is what it is. They come to us after they have, checked everything else, and they're like, oh, we can't figure it out. And then come to us and realize what it is. And then we can jump in and start helping them, figure out where it's coming from and how to mitigate it and what the things they should put in place. And, there are, several, smart operators that have done that ROI calculation, and they can see, that, even at low level infections, it's much cheaper to, do the preventative testing, cull things out, catch things early. And we see that on a regular basis, that people that do that preventative testing, it pops up. Fusarium pops up, hop latent viroid pops up, even when you think you have everything in place. And so that preventative testing really saves a lot downstream, but it's a small percentage of the market, especially with some of the large companies. They're kind of the hardest to, get in front of. There's so many decision makers, and there's people that are like, yeah, I'm not worried about that. And it's a huge problem.
Yes, that was actually one of my questions, was like, how prevalent is this in other agricultural spaces, but it sounds like it is. They've just solved for it, and it becomes a part of the standard process of testing and making sure you're
Yep.
not wiping out entire crops.
Yep.
Again, being kind of a noob to all this, it's, when I think pathogens, I think things like external to the plant. You mentioned spores and fungi and whatnot. But can you talk a little bit about the systemic nature of some of these pathogens and how they might be, like, what's the mechanism by which they get carried on to like the latter generations of the plant?
I mean, I'll explain this in the best way I understand because I'm also not a scientist. Our chief science officer could explain this perfectly with some amazing metaphor. But with hop latent viroid, it is like a really teeny tiny like piece of RNA that typically gets introduced by the tools when you're pruning the plants or cutting clones. And I mean, actually, hop latent viroid can survive like up to 6 months on dried flower. So all it takes is one of your employees rolling a joint and not washing their hands and like coming in and like de-leafing and touching a wound. It can be introduced pretty easily. But yeah, once it's in there, it's like this super small piece of RNA. It kind of like travels as the plant's growing, but it will always go down to the roots. So the roots are the best place to test for it, to have the most reliable. And you can be in one branch and not the other. So a lot of people have struggled that they're like doing comparative testing and they're trying to figure out what's going on, and the fact is that like if you are going to compare, you need to like basically take the same exact piece of tissue and put it in two different ones and send them off to whatever lab you're using if you want like a good comparison, because it can be in one leaf and not another leaf. And then Fusarium, that's a root pathogen. I mean, primarily, again, there's many different kinds, but it mostly for cannabis will kind of be in the soil and expand in the roots. And then once it gets stressed out, it like grows up in the plants and basically causes them to die.
Yeah.
Well, so for years, I've been meeting people with nurseries who will say that tissue culture cleans genetics, and that is why people should be getting tissue culture clones, because if some strain had hop, the tissue culture clone will deliver something that no longer has hop but has the original genetics. And you've told me that that's a myth. So can you break down the difference between tissue culture and what's happening there that could potentially clean the genetics or not, and why people have been saying that for so long?
Sure. So tissue culture, at its base, it is great for like storing genetics. You can like take a little piece and put it in agar in a little, cup and like store it for a long time. Just doing that, just taking a nodal piece is just like cloning, so whatever is in that piece is like still there. There's nothing about like doing that tissue culture process that's cleaning anything. So that's just first and foremost, like just people saying I have tissue culture plants is actually meaningless. You have to like talk to the tissue culture provider and find out what they're doing. And if it's nodal tissue culture, it's just like mini cloning. Apical meristem tissue culture is a process where they're actually like under a microscope, like dissecting the very like tippy top of the new growth on the plant. And that is, it will clean fungal pathogens very reliably and can clean hop latent viroid. It really is very strain specific, and it still needs to be tested when it comes out because it's only a success rate of around like 30 to 50%. So, say you take 10 of those, little apical meristems, only half of them might be clean from hop latent viroid. If the tissue culture company is, starting all their genetics that way, and then moving to just kind of, reproducing the tissue culture plants, they likely will be more clean than just regular cloning. But it is a longer process. It's more expensive. So it's important to identify like what type of tissue culture they're doing, and then still test the plants when they come out.
So starting fresh, if I were to like launch a new grow, what would be like the recommended practice for, running a clean as possible process, or at least catching things early and preventing some like catastrophic event downstream?
So I would recommend, figure out what your genetic strategy is going to be, and I would say, don't be a breeder yourself. Focus on what you do well, and go and source, plants from the breeder that you want to work with. But then make sure, even if you trust them, that you quarantine them properly. You need to test those plants 2 to 3 times, a couple weeks apart, for all those major pathogens, before introducing them to your new space. And then having good protocols in place in terms of people. I'm not an expert in all the different things of air shower or the foot baths and all that stuff. Consult with someone who wants to help you with that, but have things in place that you're just preventing stuff from like blowing in from the outside. Make sure that you have a team that really understands the SOPs and sanitation protocols with like bleaching tools. If you're going to have kind of the Eve mother stock that is protected from everything else, so you can kind of save your plants, that's a great idea, and just keep your top employees handling those plants. Those are some of the things that I would recommend. But strict quarantine and proper testing, and then ongoing testing of your mother plants is a great way to prevent things from happening that could explode, and also be able to rule that out immediately. If there are reductions in yield, you can say, well, I've been testing, it's not this, so we can check out these other avenues.
You brought up pheno hunting and breeding. There is definitely a movement when I've been in other states that don't have access to lots of nurseries, that you go into a cultivation and operation and there's often like a pheno hunting room going on, and people are trying to hunt for the next big strain. And I'm always surprised when I'll ask people like, well, how often are you getting a winner? And how often are you finding something that you love? And most recently, someone was like, oh, I found this bud that I thought was going to be so beautiful, so amazing. And then we tested it and it was super low potency, so we can't commercialize it. And it just occurs to me that there is this, there's this real huge amount of effort going in to trying to find the next best strain. But then I don't always see that same amount of effort going in to just keep the plants healthy and identifying the problems that the plants might have inside the grow operation. Like, to see a place that's doing pheno hunting but isn't doing preventative pathogen testing, I'm like, what's going on here? This seems like a strange prioritization of energy and resources. What's your take on that? Like, what's driving that type of behavior?
I mean, people like pheno hunting. It's fun. So there's usually someone that's like driving.
Testing's not fun.
Yeah, like, can I please just like have this little room over here to have fun? And I mean, I get it. It is a way to try to be unique and have something else that the rest of the market doesn't have. But it's super time consuming. And I think the other thing that people ignore about pheno hunting is that really you also need to be doing several like production trials once you have identified something that could be production ready, to make sure it's going to perform well in your production facility. And so it just, I mean, you're talking about 12 to 18 months if you're going to do that properly. And I don't know what cultivator actually has the time or money to do that. So I mean, I am not a big proponent of pheno hunting. I think that let the breeders do their good work, and then source from them, and build a relationship with them, and have a good trial program in place so that you can be cycling things through and release new things, and kind of have that also be a line item on your P&L, rather than the costs of just doing it yourself and hoping for the best. And then I mean, I'm not sure what. I mean, I talk to people every day that they're like, yeah, we got this, I can see it. I mean, it's really just, I think, people being a little overly confident that they can see something that's like actually molecular. So, there's just education that's going into that. And then either that, or, the most convincing way to sell people on, pathogen testing is that they have lost, rooms or facilities and had to start over again and lost, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. And then they're like, oh yeah, I'm going to do this forever. And we're trying to help people not have to go through that, to say, okay, we can spend a few $1,000s a month on this to, have confidence that we can catch things early.
I'm taking into the geekier, less fun realm. One of the things that we've become all too familiar with in the industry is like in these kind of more nascent parts of the industry, like the consistency and reliability of testing can be a little questionable, right? Even still today, we deal with this on the potency side and trying to get labs to create standards from one lab to the next. What is the current state of testing when it comes to pathogens? Is that something that has normalized yet, or is it something that you're still working on gaining consistency from lab to lab?
Yeah, definitely still working on consistency. This is something I've learned quite a bit about, in this role. I mean, as a nursery operator, it was super frustrating. We didn't know, if anything was accurate that we were doing. I mean, at Dark Heart, we did our own testing in house and like felt confidence about that. But then at Purple City, he was so frustrated by it that he worked with a scientist to develop his own test, and then I helped commercialize it. And so that there's people going to like great lengths to try to like feel confident in their testing. And that was one of the things that really drew me to Toomey Genomics, was kind of the scientific integrity of the founders and the extensive validation that they go through for all of the assays that are created. And when we kind of advise customers, like, okay, if you are going to shop around, like ask for the validation documents from, these other labs, like they can't produce them. So, there's just some basic things that you want to make sure, like that there's an internal control, so you can tell the difference from a negative test to a test that just didn't work at all. What is the process for collection and maintaining the integrity of the sample, so that isn't like being degraded on a tarmac in a FedEx plane. There's things that they should be able to speak to that are going to help you like feel confident in the test. And then also it can go to what they're advising and where you're taking the sample from. Like if you're testing for Fusarium and told to take a leaf sample, that shows that they have no idea, what, how the pathogen, spreads in the plant, and, or they're maybe selling you 30 different pathogens and bragging about like how many pathogens they're testing for, where most of them are not going to cause any economic damage. And so they're just, taking your money. So, having to, really kind of vet labs is super important, and there's no one regulating it. So everyone can just do whatever they want and charge whatever they want. And so, we do, take a lot of time to document everything that, that we've built, and then also keep it up to date. I mean, we've identified additional Fusarium strains that are impactful to cannabis that weren't known before, and have updated our assays for that and updated the validation documents. And so it's really, amazing to work with the scientists at Toomey because of how seriously they take all that. And, that the whole point of it is to help the growers be successful, not just, sell as many tests as possible.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting is for people that have been listening a long time, I have background in testing lab myself, and but more on the potency side, and early before COA testing was required, but that type of testing, and I see that this.
I can't hear you, NRA.
NRA, we lost your audio. No, not yet. All right, I'm going to jump in just out of interest of time. Melanie, you've spent much of your career as an operator and supporting teams and picking up all this knowledge, and now you're in the CEO seat, and that is inherently different than obviously being COO and other roles. And I'm curious as a CEO and NRA too, how has that journey been for you, and what is this new role requiring of you that maybe previous roles hadn't?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say like, I've been in the position about a year and a half, and it did take me a while to adjust from the like getting stuff done mode that I've like kind of always been in to like making space for myself to think and
Mhm.
read and kind of just strategize. And I mean, it was maybe like surprising how long that took for me to adjust to. But after like 20 years of just like I'm gonna work through the to-do list and make sure everybody's taken care of. Like that was an adjustment that now I'm kind of like really happy to be in that space and creating that time for myself to think. And I feel like we're more successful as a result of that. And then also, I mean, just really being able to you spend a lot of the time on the team. I mean, I think that's my most important job is making the conditions right for the team to thrive and do what they do best. And there's just all different personalities and skills and things going on. We've also doubled our headcount in the last year, so that we have to be really thoughtful about that. And we have some good like infrastructure in place. Like we do use the EOS system, and so we have our kind of weekly, monthly, quarterly, annual cadences and quarterly rocks and making sure there's alignment on the priorities. And so yeah, I mean that's been I feel like an area that I really love is creating that infrastructure and then also kind of adjusting as needed and working directly with the people to make sure that they have what they need.
So that's funny. We had Boston Dickerson on a few episodes ago, and he talked about EOS. Is that something that you brought along, or was it already operating within the company? And like how did you all choose to center around that as an operating system?
Yeah, they actually did have it from they had done an accelerator through CU and had a CEO before that brought that to them, and so that was great that they already had that in place and were kind of used to some of those things. And when I arrived, there was kind of a couple of the things in place, and then we've worked on like adding more of the layers onto it. It's like a whole system that is all intertwined. So I think it's important to do as much of it as possible. And but you were kind of already used to a lot of that cadence when I arrived.
Yeah, yeah. You were.
My audio, am I back?
Oh, you're coming back. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, good. I wanted to follow up on that EOS question and also ask about data and AI, because I think that one of the things that all CEOs are thinking about these days is how to integrate AI thoughtfully into their company. And I'm curious kind of how you're thinking about that.
Sure. I mean, first of all, data is a really big component of what we're doing because we're gathering, just all this information about, pathogens around the world and thinking about, how we can use that and use AI to create really like tailored recommendations and solutions for our future customers. So, we have a whole department that focuses on that. And then, of course, we're bringing AI into it. We have a whole, several champions in the company and are, this quarter actually, have one of the rocks of, focusing on actually some sales functions and really helping our sales team be more efficient using AI skills. And we brought in a consultant for that. So it's something we're taking really seriously, but also kind of checking ourselves along the way of like making sure that there's still alignment with our values, that we're still going to preserve like our customer experience, which is really important to us. And I mean, it just is all happening so fast. Like I'd say that that's like a good like 30% of my time is like thinking, researching, trialing. I mean, it's such a game changer and so complex that but we're excited about what it can do to help us.
Yeah. What you were talking about, that building that muscle of creating space for yourself to just think and strategize, and the couple core pieces that I want to highlight that you said. One is basically removing friction within the team, like that being a core part of your job and letting people shine and do good focused work. And then also structure, like leaning on a structure like EOS through structure comes more freedom of thought, right? It's like,
Mhm.
because if you don't have to think about how it's running, then it frees you up to have that time. So, I love that you pointed out those things, because I've been trying to do that for myself, and getting out of that just to do like running through the checklist. It's such an easy crutch to fall back onto.
Sure. Yep.
Well, amazing. I think we're getting towards the end here, so it is time for our last call. So, Melanie, what is your final message for our listeners? Advice, call to action, closing thought.
I just really encourage any leader that has cultivation in their business to think about the pathogens are everywhere in the world, and that it's something that that you really can't ignore. But there are solutions, and Toomey Genomics is a great partner that can help make it really affordable and approachable to make sure that that's something that's like handled carefully in your cultivation.
Amazing. Well, Melanie Nash of Toomey Genomics, thank you so much for spending the last hour with us. Very deep dive into a part of the plant that I don't often think about, especially me being more on the tail end of the supply chain. But yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. This was great.
Yay.
All right. We'll talk to you soon. Anna Ray, I feel like you have like a whole bunch of new levers to think about when you're going through people's business plans and efficiency building and all that kind of stuff.
I know. First question: are you doing pathogen testing? Apparently, it needs to be asked.
Yeah. Man, well, what did you think, folks? Are you going back through your business plans and thinking about the pathogen testing? I hope so, if you're growing plants. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for liking and subscribing and sharing and doing all the things. Please let us know what you think. Let us know who we should have on the show, what we should be talking about in this great year of change in the cannabis industry. Thank you to our teams at Vertosa and Wolf Meyer, and of course, our producer, Eric Rossetti. As always, folks, stay curious, stay informed, and keep your spirits high. Until next time, that's the show.